Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're exploring the anatomy of a disaster, the true story of the Titanic. For well over a century, the story of this famous shipwreck has been totally wrapped up in romance, legend, and pop culture mythology. But today, we're stripping all of that away. We are going to dismantle these enduring myths to reveal the real mechanical failures, the shocking boardroom decisions, and the cascading human errors that actually sent this magnificent vessel to the bottom of the North Atlantic. So let's kick things off with a pretty fundamental question. Was the Titanic actually called Unsinkable before it sailed? I mean, if you ask almost anyone today, they'll tell you the ship was universally declared completely unsinkable before it ever left port. But here is the wild truth. The Titanic was never unconditionally called unsinkable until after it was already sitting on the ocean floor. Before the disaster, trade magazines used the phrase practically unsinkable. But that was just a common marketing buzzword used for a bunch of larger liners at the time. The grand, hubristic claim of absolute unsinkability, that was completely a myth built in the aftermath.
Just listen to this quote. "I thought her unsinkable, and I based my opinion on the best expert advice available. I do not understand it." That was Philip A.S. Franklin, the vice president of the White Star Line, speaking on April 16, 1912, the literal day after the tragedy. The press immediately seized on this comment. The whole idea that the creators had tempted fate by declaring the ship completely unsinkable was essentially a post-tragedy invention. It was a way for society to somehow make sense of a catastrophe born not out of the supernatural, but of pure human hubris. The boardroom hubris. Fatal decisions made before the ship ever left port. Because really, this disaster was engineered through a series of early compromises where luxury and aesthetics were consistently prioritized over fundamental safety. Let's look at Alexander Carlisle's plan versus J. Bruce Ismay's decision. Carlisle, the ship's original designer, fully understood the risks of these giant new ocean liners. He originally planned for the ship to carry 48 lifeboats. That would have been enough to accommodate every single passenger and crew member on board. But White Star Line chairman J. Bruce Ismay flat out rejected the plan. And his reasoning? Well, 48 lifeboats would clutter the boat deck. He wanted a wide open promenade area for his first-class passengers to stroll on, so he went with just 20 lifeboats instead. So what does that actually mean in practice? 1,176. That is the absolute maximum number of people those 20 lifeboats could hold. The ship sailed with over 2,200 souls on board. And the really chilling part is that Ismay's decision was 100% legal. The Titanic was in full compliance with outdated British Board of Trade rules that based lifeboat capacity on the ship's tonnage, not the actual passenger count. But, as we know, compliance does not equal safety. Over 1,000 people were mathematically doomed before the ship even untied its mooring lines. The Iceberg collision unpacking the perfect storm of engineering flaws. When the Titanic actually struck that iceberg on April 14th, it wasn't just a simple matter of ice-piercing steel. It was a chain reaction hitting highly specific vulnerabilities. First, we have to understand the metallurgical failures. The ship didn't crash head-on, right? It suffered a glancing 6-second blow along its starboard side. But the materials were uniquely vulnerable to exactly this kind of scrape. Modern forensic analysis shows the steel plates used for the hull had high concentrations of sulfur that made them incredibly brittle in the freezing ice brine of the North Atlantic. And, to make matters worse, the high slag iron rivets holding those plates together were highly prone to snapping under sheer pressure. When researchers eventually ran Sharpie impact tests on the actual steel recovered from the wreck site, the results were stunning. They found that at the exact temperature of the water that night, the steel fractured in a 100% brittle fashion. There was zero plastic deformation, meaning it didn't bend, it just shattered like glass. So that seemingly minor, glancing impact from the iceberg was more than enough to pop those faulty rivets and shatter the brittle hull plates wide open to the sea. Uncapped bulkheads. These were watertight compartments that only sealed horizontally. See, even with the hull breached, the Titanic was actually designed to stay afloat with up to 4 of its forward compartments completely flooded. But the fatal flaw was in these bulkheads. The ship was divided into 16 compartments, but the dividing walls weren't capped at the top. They only extended a few meters above the waterline. Because 6 compartments were breached, the sheer weight of all that water pulled the front of the ship down. As one compartment filled, the water simply spilled over the top wall, right into the next one. It was literally like an overflowing ice cube tray as the ship slowly tilted forward. Compounding human errors, how operational mistakes made the tragedy drastically worse. Because yes, the mechanical failures were terrible, but they were tragically accelerated by the very people running the ship. Just take a look at this timeline, a trail of mishaps and warnings.
The disaster shouldn't have been a total surprise. In June 1911, the Titanic's sister ship, the Olympic, nearly sinks a tugboat. In September, the Olympic collides with a Royal Navy cruiser. February 1912, it loses a propeller blade. And then, on the fateful day of April 14, 1912, the Titanic's wireless operators received no fewer than 7 explicit ice warnings from other ships. 7. Yet they kept barreling forward at 22 knots into pitch-black, freezing waters.
Shut up. I am busy. I am working Cape Race. That is what the Titanic's radio operator actually said to the SS Californian. The mishandling of these warnings is just staggering. Roughly an hour before the crash, the Californian had completely stopped because of the ice field and radioed the Titanic to warn them. But the Titanic's operator was swamped. He had a massive backlog of paid, personal messages to send for wealthy passengers to a station at Cape Race. He was so annoyed by the interruption that he snapped back. He dismissed a life-saving warning because he was doing commercial busy work.
And then think about the crow's nest binocular key. It was locked away, and decades later it was actually auctioned for £90,000 in 2007. Why is this tiny, seemingly insignificant object so important? Well, it was accidentally taken off the ship by an officer who got transferred at the very last minute. Because of this, the lookouts were entirely denied binoculars. A century later, computer simulations proved that with binoculars, the lookouts would have seen the iceberg just seconds earlier, and just a few seconds would have been enough time to turn the ship and avoid the disaster entirely. The literal key to survival was locked away in a cabinet. The crew were strangers in a crisis, untrained, untried, and unfamiliar with lifeboat capacity. When the collision finally happened, the response was disastrously uncoordinated. The officers and crew had never even conducted a single lifeboat drill together. Official inquiry reports literally described them as strangers to one another. Because they were untrained and totally unaware of how many people the lifeboats could actually hold safely, terrified officers launched many of the boats half empty. It was an absolute lack of preparation that needlessly sacrificed hundreds of lives that could have easily been saved, even with the limited boats they had on hand.
The band played on. Violinist Wallace Hartley and his band played hymns to calm passengers, choosing duty over survival. Amidst all this chaos and mechanical failure, there were these profound moments of human grace. You've probably heard the legend of the band playing as the ship sank. Well, that part is absolutely true. The 8 hired musicians had actually never played together before this voyage. But as the deck tilted and panic set in, they assembled on the foredeck. They played waltzes and hymns, most famously, Nearer My God to Thee, just trying to keep the passengers calm. They chose stoic duty over their own survival. All 8 perished, but they left behind a global symbol of courage in the face of absolute despair.
Reshaping global maritime safety. The shockwaves of this tragedy fundamentally changed the world. It proved that shipping was inherently international and safety couldn't be left to outdated, borderless regulations. So, the first SOLAS Convention was adopted in 1914. Because of the Titanic, ships must now carry lifeboats for everyone on board plus an extra 25%. 24-hour continuous radio watches are absolutely mandated, prioritizing emergency signals over private messages. And it led to the creation of the International Ice Patrol, an agency that still tracks North Atlantic icebergs to this very day.
So, as we wrap up, I have a question for you. Are our modern global industries truly safe from the hubris that sank the Titanic? We've explored the whole story today. The brittle steel, the missing binoculars, the boardroom vanity, and the tragic lack of training. The regulatory frameworks we rely on today are quite literally written in the aftermath of this disaster. We like to think we've moved past the arrogance of 1912. But when you look at our modern technological marvels, our artificial intelligence, our space exploration, are we really safe? Or are we still just tempted to call our own creations unsinkable? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer.